When it comes to discussions on the de Havilland Aircraft Company, a lot of attention gets paid to their expertise in the use of wood to build aircraft. I mean, fair enough. Arguably, their most famous product was primarily built of it, after all. But truth be told, despite this famous fact being widely known in aviation history circles, de Havilland themselves were under few illusions even before the Second World War started that wooden aircraft were definitely on the way out. The future was obviously going to be in metal construction, especially in the use of aluminium alloys that were undergoing rapid improvements throughout the 1920s and 30s as their metallurgy improved. And that recognition inspired the creation of the subject of today's video, the de Havilland Flamingo. The origins of this aircraft go back to a realization that British commercial aircraft designs were falling behind against their international competition. In 1934, two new American designs flew that showed the future of air transport, the Lockheed Model 10 and the Douglas DC-2. These, in fact, followed the example of the earlier Boeing 247, being all-metal, mid-capacity aircraft that could carry between 10 and 14 passengers and cruise at around 190 miles per hour. Probably the closest equivalent to these being built by a British manufacturer was the de Havilland Rapide, which, though a fairly successful design by the standards of the day, was obviously completely outclassed by the new American aircraft. The issue was concerning enough that the British government even set up a special commission in 1937 to examine criticisms that the UK's aircraft builders were not responding to changing markets and had failed to deliver decent competitors. To be frank, the primary reason for continued lack of interest by British builders in creating new civil airliners was that they were, by that point, largely committed to building military aircraft for the rapidly expanding Royal Air Force. But in fact, one company, de Havilland, had recognised the need to build new, modern civil designs and were in the process of developing two. The first, the de Havilland Albatross, utilised their knowledge of wooden construction and was what is often called one of the most graceful designs of the era, an aircraft that I will get around to covering one day. The second, the Flamingo, was a real break from the company's roots. There is also a bit of mystery concerning the Flamingo's construction that I want to address now before getting more into the video. John Dell at the Dinger Aviation website, who provided a huge amount of the material used in the production of this video, has made one interesting observation on the generally recorded fact that the Flamingo was of metal construction. He points out that while the aircraft was primarily of metal build, the upper and lower wing panels on the prototype at least were of fabric, and he is unsure if this was just a one-off or a production standard, as seems to be indicated by some sources. It seems a minor point, but if anyone knows for sure the truth of this, it would be nice to know for sure. And John, know you'll watch this, for my money and looking at pictures of the production Flamingos, they certainly look like metal rather than fabric construction panels on the wings, but that's just on what I can see rather than know for sure. And anyway, to return to the subject, it's also possible that the decision to switch to metal didn't go down well with everyone at the company, as de Havilland's chief designer, Arthur Ernest Hagg, resigned upon completion of the Albatross, his final design with a company that he'd worked at since its foundation in 1920, leaving de Havilland to have to find a new head of design. Hagg had worked on all of de Havilland's aircraft and led the creation of their most successful designs of the day, and though the stated reason for his quitting the company was that he wanted to instead work on designing yachts, it's notable that he would later work with other aero companies on wooden designs. I'll admit, just a bit of speculation on my part, but regardless of the reasoning, Hagg was replaced at de Havilland by R.E. Bishop, who would lead the company design team in creating legendary aircraft like the Mosquito, the Vampire, and the Comet. But when he was promoted to the job of head designer in late 1936, Bishop's first job was to create what was to become the Flamingo. This was a short to medium range and capability airliner and postal aircraft that was intended to operate on European routes primarily. However, to comply with American requirements to attempt to win orders there, the crew was composed of three: pilot, co-pilot, and radio operator. Passenger configuration was variable so as to meet different requirements, and notionally the maximum that could be carried was 20. But as demonstrated on the Dinger Aviation website, this configuration would mean no baggage could be carried and range would likely be limited to as little as 250 miles. Instead, it seems that 17 passengers was a more likely maximum practical number, with other configurations carrying 8 or 12 also being more popular, with the Flamingo carrying 8 passengers having a maximum range in the order of 1,400 miles. To power their new metal aircraft, de Havilland also broke another tradition, not relying on their own range of engines as usual, but instead adopting the Bristol Perseus 9-cylinder radial engine that produced 930 horsepower. The two of these fitted to the Flamingo gave it a top speed of 243 miles per hour and a cruising speed of 204 miles per hour, comparable to competing foreign designs, with the engine nacelles also holding the retracting undercarriage. Because of the Flamingo's intended role as primarily a passenger aircraft, great efforts were made to improve comfort. The windows were double glazed and the cabin was well insulated to cut down on flight noise, as well as the aircraft interior being temperature controlled. Headroom was ample for standing passengers, something that often wasn't the case in aircraft of the era, and the high mounted wing allowed an excellent view for passengers, an important selling point for both flyers and airlines at the time. The low slung body also meant that passengers boarding didn't need a high staircase, and loading unloading the cargo area was simplified by being so close to the ground. The first flight took place in late December 1938, and though it took a few months to get some stability issues sorted out with the prototype, the aircraft generated a lot of interest. The efforts expended on passenger comfort, as well as the aircraft's ability to maintain altitude on a single engine, meant that it was soon gathering attention from prospective buyers, with the first order being placed by Jersey Airways in June 1939, and de Havilland's setting up a production line. The future did indeed look pretty rosy for de Havilland's new transport, and it seems likely that had events not transpired the way they did, then the Flamingo might well have become a standard airliner for British and possibly international customers. But that was not to be, which may be a good thing as will become apparent, and the outbreak of war in September meant that the Flamingo was to take a different path. Initially, it did seem that a military order was on the cards. The aircraft already constructed were taken over by the Royal Air Force, and they made a good enough impression that the Air Ministry requested that de Havilland build them a variant specifically for military use. This, named the Hertfordshire, differed in a number of ways. The passenger windows were replaced with portholes. The small passenger access door was replaced with a larger hatch to allow the loading of cargo, and the interior was altered for military duties. The Hertfordshire was capable of carrying 18 troops, or 10 stretchers, or cargoes as large as complete aircraft engines, or else 2 large tanks for carrying water or fuel, which were of the same type utilised by the Bristol Bombay, which had entered service as the RAF's new transport a couple of years previously. An order for 30 Hertfordshires was considered, but the idea was abandoned so that de Havilland could concentrate on building moth-like trainers instead. As it was, the single Hertfordshire built was joined by the original prototype and the first production aircraft ordered by Jersey Airways, which was taken over by the RAF. Additionally, the Air Ministry took over the order for the 2 Jersey aircraft in production, changing the specifications so that they could carry 8 passengers in comfortable arrangements. These, operating with 24 Squadron, were used as VIP transports and were in constant use shuttling important personnel between England and France during the first months of the conflict, the so-called phony war period. The Flamingos were certainly popular with their passengers, and Churchill was reputed to have said that the Flamingo was his most favourite aircraft. The crisis engendered by the fall of France in June 1940 and the possibility of invasion saw a new Flamingo built for use with a new unit, the King's Flight, whose job it was to evacuate the royal family should the worst happen and the UK fall. When the crisis was over, the aircraft went to No. 24 Squadron to join its other brethren, while fresh orders for 8 aircraft for the British Overseas Airways Corporation, the BAOC, were completed between September 1940 and April 1941. These aircraft were all deployed to Egypt and flew routes from there across the Middle East and East Africa. Unfortunately, the heavy usage meant that some rather nasty problems started to come to light with the aircraft. In October 1940, the one Hertfordshire built crashed, killing all 11 passengers and crew on board. And in April 1942, another RAF Flamingo was lost, this one causing an international incident, as amongst the dead was a delegation of 4 Soviet officers, one of whom was a famous bomber pilot. The BOAC aircraft also reported having problems, having issues operating in the hot climate, and when 3 were lost between September 1942 and February 1943, the crew's confidence in the type plummeted. Following this, the aircraft were pretty much grounded and then returned to the UK, where they largely languished. A single example retained in the UK was transferred to the Royal Navy for liaison duties, and then, after the war, ended up in the hands of British Air Transport. This company used the aircraft for charter flights for a couple of years, and work even started on restoring some of the old BOAC aircraft for use by the airline. But these efforts all fizzled out, and by 1954, all of the 16 Flamingos produced had gone to the scrapyard. The Flamingo is a classic aviation tale of bad timing combined with issues from utilizing new and unfamiliar construction techniques. Generally remembered as a failure because of the limited run and the heavy loss rates, in fact, the Flamingo did make a small but valuable contribution to the war effort in the early days and, more importantly, was able to provide lessons to de Havilland on what was needed in the marketplace. These lessons they certainly took to heart, as their next light transport, the Dove, was an extremely successful design, all the more impressive for succeeding in a market flooded with cheap wartime production aircraft. Huge thanks to John Dell at Dinger Aviation website. I shall link to the webpage on the Flamingo in the description. It's well worth checking out as it has far more detail on this aircraft as well as individual histories of all the Flamingos built. Cheers everyone, have a good one, and I'll catch you all again soon.